Okay, today we're going to start into chapter 4. Now, chapter 4 covers some of the major empires, the Empire of Egypt, the Empire of Persia. And it also talks about early Chinese history and some of the dynasties that were created there. We'll get started here as a little bit of review with Roman numeral 1, how nomadic invaders for some time period ruled Egypt. They were called the Hyksos, and they were introduced back in chapter 2. The Hyksos came into play around 1650. Egypt began to lose power due to infighting, civil wars, and weak leadership. And the Hyksos were nomadic peoples. They crossed over the Isthmus of Suez, and they had war chariots. At this time, chariots were not on the Egyptians' understanding list, and they conquered the Egyptians in battle. And they ruled Egypt for roughly 70 years, 1640 to 1570 BC. It was during the time that the Hyksos were in power that the Hebrews migrated in. We learned about this in chapter 3, section 4. And one of the things that's important is to understand that the Hyksos were from a similar region that the Hebrews were from. So they had a common geographic background, a common racial similarity. And so they allowed the Hebrews to migrate in. And that's really why the Hebrews went to Egypt during that time. Eventually, though, around 1500 BC, a series of warlike military leaders began to restore Egypt's power and try to drive the Hyksos out. One female ruler named Queen Ahotep actually took over for her husband, who was killed in a battle. And then later, another descendant of theirs, Kamos, worked the military to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt. These rulers and their descendants are the ones that actually enslaved the Hebrew peoples until around roughly 1200 BC, when it is estimated that the Exodus may have occurred. Roman numeral number 2 is going to talk about how the overthrow of the Hyksos marks in Egyptian history the New Kingdom, which spanned from 1570 all the way down to 1075 BC. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom sought to create an empire. They wanted to go out and conquer others and expand their land and control. Remember that an empire is when one ruler brings several formerly independent groups or states under their control. The Egyptians used bronze weapons and two-wheeled chariots that they had adopted off of the Hyksos. This is an example of cultural diffusion, and the Egyptians became conquerors. Pharaohs, or Egyptian leaders as you can recall, established armies that included archers, charioteers, and also infantry. Infantry are your basic foot soldiers. Next, we have a famous female ruler of Egypt. Her name is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut actually declared herself pharaoh around 1472 BC. She took over for her stepson, who was Thutmose III or Thutmoses III. He was actually the true male heir to the throne, but because he was very young, like under 5, she stepped in as what we call a regent ruler. Okay, her husband had passed away. She was actually very unique because she encouraged trade instead of waging war. So she was more about trading than conquering. Items that were sought by Hatshepsut and the Egyptians in trade were frankincense, myrrh, and also fragrant ointments for religious ceremonies. In addition, gold, ivory, and unusual plants and animals were sought. Let's talk about that stepson, though. When he comes of age, he's going to want to rule. His name was Thutmose III, and when he does come into power, he was very militaristic. Hatshepsut's stepson proved to be a much more warlike ruler in reality. During his reign, he led a number of victorious invasions eastward into Palestine and also the modern-day region of Syria. His armies pushed into the south into a region that we call Nubia, which is part of Africa. It's along the upper Nile River, which means in the southern portion of the Nile. Egypt became a powerful empire, controlling and collecting tribute, as we've learned, payments from weaker powers to them, and also lands around the Nile and even far beyond into the Middle East. Next is capital letter D. Eventually, the Egyptians run into the Hittites, which we learned about in chapter 3, section 1. And we'll talk about that major battle that we call Kadesh. The Egyptian conquest into Syria and Palestine around 1400 BC brought them into a conflict with a group there that had an empire called the Hittites. The major battle of Kadesh occurred around 1285 BC. And then after this battle, which ended in a draw, by the way, Ramses II, the Egyptian pharaoh at the time, and a Hittite king made a treaty that promised peace and protection. This alliance between these two groups lasted for the remainder of the century. This is known as the world's first documented peace treaty. Next, we'll take a look at Roman numeral 3 and talk about how the Egyptian Empire once again declines. And this is due to invasion by land and sea. After the reigns of Thutmose III and Ramses II, strong civilizations surrounding Egypt came to power around 1200. The Egyptian and also the Hittite empires were both attacked by unknown invaders that we only know in history as the Sea Peoples. Historians are not exactly sure who the Sea Peoples were. A good question to research is, who could the Sea Peoples have been? The Sea Peoples, we do know, came in off of boats, what is written about them. They attacked quickly with great force, and they caused great devastation. They took out Egypt, which was a major civilization. They took out the Hittites, which was a very strong militaristic civilization as well. There were other groups that we will learn about that the Sea Peoples may have conquered also. Next is capital B. Talk about how Egypt's empire starts to fade after these Sea Peoples attacks. After the invasions, Egypt could not recover its power, and it started to split apart into small regional units, and independent kingdoms began to arise. At this time, a group called the Libyans from the west crossed over the desert into the Nile Delta region. From about 950 to 730 BC, the Libyan peoples had conquered Egypt, and they ruled as pharaohs and created other cities. The Libyans chose to actually adopt the Egyptian way of life instead of imposing their own. This is an example of cultural diffusion, but also an example of what we call assimilation. Roman numeral 4, we'll talk about another group called the Kushites. I'm going to move to a map real quick so you can see kind of where I'm talking about. So this would be where the Hittites were from, up here into modern-day Turkey, and then down in here into the Palestine region of Syria. This is Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Down here is a region that we refer to as Nubia. And this is where the remaining groups that we'll talk about today came from. Libya would be located over here to the west of Egypt, and they came across up in this region and then attacked Egypt from, I would say, the northwest. Okay, next. The Kingdom of Kush is a Nubian kingdom. I just showed you where Nubia was. They actually were a longtime trading partner with the Egyptians, but the Egyptians had kind of controlled Kush for a very long time. The kingdom lasted for about 1,000 years, from 2000 BC to 1000 BC. But as Egypt began to fall into decline during the Hyksos power, the Kushites of Nubia became a regional power. Nubia eventually established its own Kushite dynasty on the throne of Egypt. Let's talk about the interaction before this happens between Nubia and Egypt. Several Nubian kingdoms, including Kush, served as a trade corridor between Egypt and the interior of Africa. During the revival of the New Kingdom, pharaohs forced Egyptian rule over Nubia and especially the Kushites. Egyptian governors, priests, soldiers, and artists had a strong influence on the Nubian peoples. During the Egyptian decline around 1200 BC, Kush regained its independence. The Kushites believed that they were more suitable to rule Egypt than the Libyans, and therefore they ended up conquering the Libyans and taking over control of Egypt. One of the kings that was responsible for this was named King Pianki, in capital letter C here. He was a Kushite king who in 751 BC overthrew the Libyan dynasty that had ruled Egypt for over 200 years. Though in 671 BC, the Assyrians, a warlike people who we will learn about in this chapter, came in from the southwest Asia and conquered Egypt, which pushed the Kushites back south into Nubia. Once they get back to Nubia in the south, they are no longer controlling Egypt, and they establish a new city called Meroe. Meroe is a city in which the Kushites eventually moved to in the south that was close to the Red Sea, which allowed the Kushite people to trade and flourish in Africa, Arabia, and all the way into India. Here's why they were so successful in the south in Meroe. There were many natural resources there. Meroe experienced a lot of rainfall, and therefore its land was extremely fertile. It was also a place that had an abundance of what we call iron ore. As a result of iron ore, Meroe became a major manufacturer of iron weapons and tools, and they began to export those in the form of trade. Merchants would transport iron goods by way of donkey all the way to the Red Sea in exchange for things like jewelry, cotton cloth, silver, and glass coming from India and Arabia. Eventually, like most civilizations that we will learn about this year, they went into decline. The Kushites of Meroe were prosperous from about 250 BC into about AD 150. Meroe began to decline around AD 150 when another African kingdom came to power. That African kingdom was called Aksum. This African kingdom is located in what is now Ethiopia/Eritrea, and it reached its height of power in the 4th century AD. The 4th century AD would be the 300s. Okay. Thank you.